The sound of porcelain shattering against polished marble cut through the restaurant like a gunshot, and every head turned at once. For a heartbeat, the only thing louder than the crash was the silence that followed. The young waitress stood frozen in the center of the dining room, hands trembling, shards of a fallen dessert plate scattered at her feet like the pieces of something far more fragile. And then came the voice, sharp, cold, unforgiving, belonging to a man used to being obeyed. Jacob Whitmore had built an empire from nothing. At least that was the story printed in business magazines across the United States. CEO, visionary, self-made billionaire. His name carried weight in Manhattan boardrooms and Silicon Valley conferences alike. But tonight, in a high-end restaurant in downtown Chicago, it carried something else. Contempt. The waitress's name was Megan. She couldn't have been more than 23. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, her uniform crisp but clearly mended at the hem. She had been moving too quickly, juggling too many tables, trying too hard not to disappoint anyone. The dessert had slipped when her wrist twisted just slightly wrong. That was all it took. Jacob's expensive suit remained spotless, but his ego did not. His face flushed with fury as he stood up slowly from his table, the clink of his gold watch echoing in the stillness. He didn't yell at first. He spoke in a voice that cut deeper than shouting ever could. He asked her if she understood how much that plate cost. He asked if she had any idea who he was. He asked if she thought this was some kind of joke. Megan's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes filled, but she fought the tears, because crying would only make it worse. She had learned that the hard way. Have you ever stood there, heart pounding, knowing everyone is watching you fail? Have you ever felt so small that the floor beneath you seemed safer than the eyes staring down at you? If you were her, what would you do? Apologize again? Beg? Or just endure it and hope it ends quickly? The restaurant manager hurried over, apologizing profusely to Jacob, promising to take the dessert off the bill, promising to handle the waitress. Megan's hands shook harder. She knew what handle meant. A write-up, maybe suspension, maybe losing the job she desperately needed. In the corner booth near the window sat a man who hadn't said a word yet. His name was Marcus. His brown hair was slightly unkempt and his jacket was worn at the elbows. Across from him sat a little girl with curly dark hair and wide, observant eyes. Her name was Ava, and she was 8 years old. Marcus had been watching everything. He wasn't dressed like the other diners. No tailored suit, no designer watch. Just a simple button-down shirt and tired eyes that had seen more than most people in that room. He was a single father, a mechanic by trade, a widower by circumstance. 3 years ago, his wife Hannah had died from an aggressive illness that swallowed their savings and then her life. Since then, Marcus had been raising Ava alone, learning how to braid hair from YouTube tutorials, packing lunches with little notes tucked inside, working double shifts to keep their small apartment in Ohio warm during winter. This dinner wasn't something they did often. It was Ava's birthday. She had begged for a fancy place with cloth napkins. So he drove 2 hours to Chicago to make her smile. And now, her birthday dinner had turned into something else. Ava watched Megan with a look Marcus knew too well. It was the look of someone recognizing pain. Children notice more than adults think. Ava had seen her father cry only once, quietly, in the kitchen, when he thought she was asleep. She had never forgotten it. Jacob's voice rose slightly now, enough to draw uncomfortable shifts from nearby tables. He said that people like her should be grateful for jobs at all. He said that incompetence was the reason businesses failed. He said he expected excellence, even in something as simple as carrying a plate. Megan whispered an apology, barely audible. She bent down to gather the shards, hands so unsteady that one piece nicked her finger. A thin line of blood appeared, but she didn't react. Pain was something she had grown used to. She had grown up in a small town in Indiana. Her father had left when she was 10. Her mother worked 2 jobs and still couldn't keep up with rent. Megan had promised herself she would never depend on anyone. She moved to Chicago at 18 with 2 suitcases and a scholarship that didn't cover enough. Waitressing paid the bills while she took night classes in nursing. She was so close to finishing, so close to building a different life. And here she was, being dismantled in front of strangers. Marcus felt something tightening in his chest. Not anger at first, something heavier. Recognition. He remembered the hospital receptionist who had once snapped at him when he couldn't pay up front. He remembered the way people looked at him after Hannah died, as if grief were contagious. He remembered feeling powerless. Ava's small hand reached across the table and squeezed his. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Jacob finally turned to sit back down, satisfied that his point had been made. The manager ushered Megan toward the kitchen, whispering urgently. The room slowly began to breathe again. That was when Marcus stood up. It wasn't dramatic. No chair thrown back, no shouting. Just a steady rise, like a man who had made a decision long before he moved. He walked toward Jacob's table, Ava's curious eyes following him. Conversations dimmed again, sensing something. Marcus stopped a few feet away. He didn't puff his chest or raise his voice. He simply spoke, calm but firm. He said that accidents happen. He said that no plate, no matter how expensive, was worth humiliating someone who was working hard. He said that leadership wasn't proven by how loudly you could criticize, but by how gently you could correct. Jacob looked up, surprised that someone had dared interrupt him. He scanned Marcus's clothes, his worn shoes, the absence of status symbols. Dismissal flickered across his face. Marcus continued. He said he was a mechanic from Ohio. He said he didn't know much about billion-dollar companies, but he knew what it was like to lose everything. He knew what it was like to depend on the kindness of strangers. He said that the little girl watching from that booth was learning what strength looked like tonight, and he wanted to make sure she learned the right lesson. The words weren't eloquent. They weren't rehearsed. They were raw. Something shifted in the room. Other diners straightened in their seats. The manager paused mid-step. Even Megan, peeking from the kitchen doorway with a tissue wrapped around her finger, stopped breathing. Marcus then did something no one expected. He reached into his wallet and pulled out every dollar he had in cash. It wasn't much, maybe a couple hundred, saved carefully for this special night. He placed it on Jacob's table. He said that if the broken plate mattered that much, he would cover it. But he would not let a young woman be shamed over it. A hush fell over the restaurant. Jacob stared at the money. It was insignificant compared to what he earned in an hour. But the gesture carried a weight that made his jaw tighten. He looked around and, for the first time that evening, noticed the eyes on him. Not admiring, not intimidated, but judging. Ava had left her seat and stood quietly beside her father now. She slipped her small hand into his again, looking up at him with pride so pure it almost hurt to see. Jacob's mind flickered back decades, to a memory he rarely allowed himself to revisit. He saw his own father, a factory worker in Detroit, coming home exhausted and smelling of oil. He remembered the night his father had been fired after a supervisor humiliated him on the assembly line. He remembered the rage in his father's eyes, the shame. He remembered promising himself he would never be that powerless. Somewhere along the way, in climbing to the top, he had become the very voice that once crushed his family. He looked at Megan, standing there with a bandaged finger, trying to shrink into the background. She wasn't lazy. She wasn't incompetent. She was just human. The restaurant manager cleared his throat, unsure how to navigate the moment. Jacob slowly pushed the money back toward Marcus. His voice, when he finally spoke, was different, quieter. He said the plate wasn't the issue. He said he may have overreacted. The words seemed foreign in his mouth, like a language he had forgotten. He stood up again, this time not towering but almost uncertain. He walked toward Megan. The entire room watched. He apologized. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't poetic. But it was real. Megan's eyes widened. She nodded, unsure whether to believe what she was hearing. The manager exhaled visibly. Jacob then did something else unexpected. He asked Megan about her studies after overhearing someone mention nursing. She hesitated but answered. He listened, truly listened. When she explained how close she was to finishing but how tuition was overwhelming, something in his expression softened further. That night, Jacob left a tip that was more than generous. It was transformative. But more than the money, it was the shift in his posture, the humility in his tone, that lingered. Marcus returned to his table, heart still pounding. Ava wrapped her arms around him, whispering that he was brave. He smiled, though his hands still shook slightly. He hadn't planned any of it. He had simply refused to let cruelty be the loudest voice in the room. Weeks later, a letter arrived at the small apartment in Ohio. Inside was a handwritten note from Megan. She wrote that she had been offered a scholarship funded anonymously through a new initiative started by a certain CEO, an initiative for working students in the service industry. She didn't know if Marcus had any connection to it, but she wanted to thank him. She said that his courage had changed more than just one evening. Marcus read the letter twice, then placed it carefully in a drawer beside Hannah's old photographs. Ava asked what it said. He told her that sometimes standing up for someone can ripple further than you ever see. Jacob, meanwhile, began attending leadership seminars not as a speaker, but as a student. He visited his father's grave for the first time in years. He made quiet changes in his company culture, policies about respect, about employee treatment, about humility. One broken plate had revealed fractures far deeper, and one mechanic with calloused hands had reminded a powerful man what strength truly meant. Years later, Megan would graduate as a registered nurse. She would work long shifts in an emergency room in Chicago, holding the hands of strangers in their most vulnerable moments. Sometimes, when a patient lashed out in fear or pain, she would remember that night. She would choose patience. Ava would grow up believing that dignity was worth defending, no matter the cost. And Jacob would carry that evening like a scar, visible only to him, but shaping every decision thereafter. Before this story ends, take a moment and tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were sitting in that restaurant that night. If this story truly touched your heart, if it reminded you of the power of kindness, of second chances, of standing up when it's easier to stay silent, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Because sometimes the smallest act of courage can change more lives than we ever imagine.